Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Army Heritage Education Center's Perspectives in Military History Lecture Series. It's now my pleasure to introduce the Director of the Military History Institute, Dr. Conrad Crane.
Thank you, thank you. Save your applause for Pete. He deserves it more than me. I wanted to ask to introduce Pete. Pete and I go back a number of years. Pete is a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy. Did all the things he needs to through the military education process, including being a graduate of the Advanced Strategic Art program here at the War College. I knew Pete back when he was still a senior captain at West Point, and one of the miracle things is he did well in the Army despite the fact that I actually rated him. He survived my rating, my OERs.
Worse yet, you coached me on the softball team.
That was good. We won one championship when you were there, if I remember. So it was good. Yeah, he was good. Anybody who's a good softball player gets extra points in my book, which is why I probably got good ratings. But Pete was a super instructor at West Point. Went on to do super things in the Army, and you'll hear about some of those tonight. He commanded his brigade in Baghdad, and I'll talk about that tonight. He also was General Petraeus' XO during the surge in Iraq. So he has a distinguished military record and had a lot to do with the key events in Iraq that have turned things around over there. He is currently the General Raymond Mason Chair of Military History at Ohio State University, which is the flagship program for military history in the United States. Pete had a tough choice. If he stayed in the Army, Pete Mansoor would be Brigadier General Pete Mansoor right now. And he had a choice about staying in the Army, becoming a Brigadier General, serving the institution that he loved for 10 more years or so, or moving out of the military into civilian academia where arguably he'll have a lot more influence on the institution, because right now the program that's producing the most military historians is Ohio State, and the best military historians from their graduate program. And so he's going to have influence not just on the Army, even the many officers he sends to West Point who are sent out there for his tutelage before they teach, but also for the whole field of military history. So Pete, again, it's a loss to the Army, but I think overall it was a great gain for not only the Army, but also academia as a whole. He has his Ph.D. from Ohio State, so it's not surprising he walks around with his Ohio State pin on. But he has also great credit to the Army as well. And before I bring him up here to talk, I want to reflect on my great contribution to his book, which when I got to read a draft of it, I said, you know, Pete, you need to put in the back that email you sent to me back in July of 2003 when you first got to Iraq about what you had seen over there as a brigade commander. And I want to read a little bit of this email to you, and to give you kind of a sense of where we're going tonight. He starts out and he says, "Greetings from Central Baghdad. I took command of the 1st Brigade, 1st Armored Division on 1 July. You graduated about the 10th of June, right?
6th of June.
6th of June. So 3 to 4 weeks later, he goes from being here at the War College to commanding a brigade in the middle of Iraq. He said, since then I've had 2 soldiers killed in firefights. The special operations folks call my sector east of the Tigris River the hot box, due to the number of engagements on a daily basis. I travel with a loaded 9mm pistol on my hip. This place reminds me of Mad Max and the Road Warrior movies." And he goes through and he talks about all the things he learned at the War College. "I'm living in interesting times and I'm using every bit of the strategy education learned in ASAP and at the War College." He goes through and talks about all the things that he's done. But the part that strikes me the most when he talks about working with the Iraqis and the various missions, he says, "I have flashbacks to The Godfather all the time. As the military commander of Eastern Baghdad, I feel like Don Corleone, or maybe a ward boss on the south side of Chicago." So with that, let me introduce the South Chicago ward boss from Baghdad, Pete Mansoor.
Thanks, Con. And that was just in the first 2 weeks. Yeah. Well, thanks, Con, for that kind introduction, and from our Michigan friend here, go Bucks. It's quite an honor to be asked to come back and speak in Carlisle Barracks, where I resided as a student back in 2002 and 2003. I remember looking at a lot of speakers here as a student And to be one is, again, quite an honor. But lest I exaggerate my own importance, I'm going to get rid of all these ancillary mics here. Stay, boy. Lest I exaggerate my own importance coming back as a guest speaker, I'm reminded of a vignette that occurred when General Petraeus and I had returned to Washington for the second of his semi-annual grillings at the hand of our legislators in Washington. As we were waiting to go in to the Senate Armed Services Committee room, out in the hallway there were a few staffers that were talking about the momentous event and how important it was, and how General Petraeus had become sort of a really important figure in D.C. And then they got into this sort of intellectual discussion of what was true importance in our nation's capital. And one of the staffers said, well, true importance is a personal meeting with the President in the Oval Office. And they all sort of nodded their heads at that. But the second staffer quickly countered that real importance was a personal meeting with the President in the Oval Office, at which the hotline rang. And when it did, the President was so enwrapped at what the Speaker was saying that he ignored it. And that had everyone sort of nodding until a particularly long-served staffer who had spent quite a bit of time in the West Wing and on the staff of the National Security Council settled the question once and for all, explaining that true importance was a personal meeting with the President in the Oval Office, during which, when the hotline rang, the President answered the phone, then held it out and said, "Here, General Petraeus, it's for you." This evening I'm going to talk about my latest book, Baghdad at Sunrise, A Brigade Commander's War in Iraq, which is about my time as a brigade commander and my brigade's achievements in Iraq in 2002 or 2003 and 2004. But really what it is I use the brigade as a lens to look at the wider issues surrounding that first crucial year of the war. Some of you out there have served in Iraq, and I know that many of you may not agree with my conclusions. But after 26 years in the Army, one of the great things that I have discovered about my transition into civilian life in academia is it no longer matters whether or not that I'm right, because I have tenure. Baghdad at Sunrise is my personal journey as a brigade combat team commander, but it's also more than that. When I went to Iraq from the War College, it was the first time in then my 23-year career, or 21-year career, that I had been to war. And for some people, like the current year groups coming out of commissioning, they go to war right away. For the class of '82, at least for me, because I missed the Gulf War, it was 21 years before I saw combat. And I knew that it would be a significant point in my life. And I wanted to record the events so that my kids, and then after them the grandkids, could understand what, Dad and Granddad had done in the big one. So every night, no matter how tired I was, I recorded the day's events in a journal. And it was usually after long 18, 20-hour days. I'd scribble for 15, 20 minutes in the journal. And then I took them back with me to Germany after the 13 months in combat were over. And I sort of put them aside for about a year. And then once I gave up brigade command, I picked up the journals again and I started reading through them. And I realized that no one would understand heads or tails what I had done during my year in Iraq, because they were so disjointed. There was nothing connecting the day-to-day entries into the journal. So I said, well, okay, I'll turn this into a privately held manuscript for my family. So, sort of an autobiography. And that way they'll understand what happened. And I started to write it. I was then on a year at the Council on Foreign Relations as a senior military fellow, so I had some time, especially on nights and weekends. But as I started to write it, I realized that I had a more important story to tell that was not being told to the American people. what went right and wrong in that first crucial year in Iraq at the brigade combat team level, but using it as a lens to look at the wider strategic decisions and operational decision making that was then influencing what was happening on the streets of Baghdad and the rest of Iraq. And moreover, I felt that there were lessons that had to be captured from that period, which I did in the final chapter entitled Reflections. So I then proceeded to turn the manuscript into Baghdad, what became Baghdad at Sunrise. I think that the book has filled a gap in the history of the Iraq War. Early on, we had a lot of memoirs by junior soldiers and officers, and although some of these are quite good, like Nate Fick's One Bullet Away, but they all sort of fall into the category of there I was, and it was hot, and it was dusty, and the people didn't understand what we were saying, and we were getting shot at, and all good stuff, but no broader context. On the other hand, you had books by reporters who were on the outside of the institution looking in, many of them not having spent enough time in Iraq really to understand all the nuances of what was happening there. And then the final set of memoirs coming out of the war were by senior political and military leaders, which tended to do, one of these numbers. It was his fault, and very self-serving for the most part. And I felt that what I needed to do was write something explaining the intermediate level of command and what went on there, and then again how the decisions above were influencing what was happening below and vice versa. Baghdad at Sunrise was the first work in the Iraq War by a brigade combat team commander, which I think is the key to understanding the Iraq War. In many senses, it was a brigade commander's war. It was the first echelon that contained most of the assets needed to prosecute counterinsurgency operations. Civil affairs, psychological operations, engineers, counterintelligence, and so forth. Now, since then, a lot of these assets have been pushed down to lower levels, which is good, but in 2003 and 2004, that was not the case. We owned ground. We were responsible for areas of the country. We provided a necessary link between the civil government and military command. And finally, the brigade commanders at that point held the authority to spend money from the Commander's Emergency Relief Program. So for all those reasons, I think understanding what happened in Iraq that first year, you have to look at the brigade level. But beyond that, I wrote the book for the general reader. I really wanted it to be accessible to the wider civilian audience. Hopefully it was not just a story worth telling, but a story well told. And my standard in this regard is my daughter Kyle, who's a junior at KU, the University of Kansas, Rock Chalk Jayhawk, who read it and said, "Hey, Dad, you should get on The Daily Show." High praise indeed from the newest, greatest generation. So what went wrong in Iraq that first year? I'm going to skip by the decision to go to war because I don't deal with it in the book. I can address it during Q&A if you want. I think the first thing that went wrong is we had a belief in operational prowess and tactical and technological superiority of U.S. forces that blinded American leaders to wider issues involved in the invasion of Iraq. In the 1990s, various military officers, defense analysts, and commentators posited a coming revolution in military affairs based on information dominance coupled with precision-guided munitions. Integral to concepts such as network-centric warfare was near-perfect intelligence from manned and unmanned sensors, satellites, and other intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets. Accurate and timely information would lead to battle space dominance, just-in-time servicing of targets with attacks from extended ranges, and the execution of rapid, decisive operations that would quickly and precisely collapse an enemy armed force or regime at its center of gravity, in the words of Karl von Clausewitz, the hub of all power and movement on which everything depends. Every military historian has to give at least one Clausewitz quote during his lecture, so you'll get two tonight, actually. That's the first one. What these commentators missed was that this revolution in military affairs had already been consummated in the 1991 Gulf War. Inevitably, America's enemies would either catch up or move on. The issue in the 1990s was not how to perfect the information precision revolution, which is what the Army was focused on, but what would come next. The answer would come in New York City and at the Pentagon and in the mountains and deserts of Afghanistan and in the cities and palm groves of Iraq. The expectation in Iraq was that after regime change occurred, Iraq would be just a large peacekeeping operation, Kosovo on steroids, if you will. A difficult stability operation, but nothing more than that. However, it quickly became apparent that in toppling Saddam Hussein from power and dismantling the ruthless apparatus of government that had kept the Ba'ath Party in power for over 3 decades, the United States and its allies had unleashed forces that at the time were not well understood. This was a struggle for the future of the Iraqi people and a fight to contain extremist violence that would take time, blood, and treasure to bring under control. Now, the fundamental error that the Bush administration made was fighting the war they wanted to fight rather than understanding the war they had unleashed. And this is where the prominent 19th century military philosopher Karl von Clausewitz comes into play again, because he had this to write in On War, that the first, the supreme, the most far-reaching act of judgment that the statesman and commander have to make is to establish the kind of war on which they are embarking, neither mistaking it for nor trying to turn it into something that is alien to its nature. Now, the Bush administration justified the Iraq war on grounds of national security. The hunt for weapons of mass destruction, the proverbial mushroom clouds over American cities that they used to justify the invasion. But beyond this, they had a series of assumptions, and primary among those was that this would be a war of liberation, that the Iraqis would largely welcome U.S. soldiers with open arms, throw flowers and candy at their feet, and celebrate their liberation from the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. Well, was it a liberation or was it something else? Because as time went on, it was clear that assumption had fallen short of the mark. And it should have been re-examined by the summer of 2003 at the very latest, that is, several months into the war. Regrettably, those assumptions weren't really re-examined until the fall of 2006, several years into the war. And in the meantime, we had expended much blood and treasure for little gain in Iraq. The evidence for the emergence of the insurgency was clear and should have led to a comprehensive reevaluation of the war effort, from political policy to strategy, and from the operational concept being employed or lack thereof to tactics, techniques, and procedure being used by troops on the ground. Regrettably, it did not. The administration had gone to war with a preconceived notion of the kind of war it wanted to fight, and when presented evidence to the contrary, simply stuck its head in the sand. This is the only way you can explain Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, as late as November 2003 in a meeting of the National Security Council, exclaiming, "Don't talk to me about an insurgency, there isn't one." This in the midst of the insurgent Ramadan offensive in 2003, which my unit, among others, was battling, the first really clear indication of the coalescence of the insurgency. As for Combined Joint Task Force 7, under the command of Lieutenant General Ricardo Sanchez, it lacked more than just enough troops to accomplish its mission. It lacked imagination and insight into Iraqi history and culture and their impact on the mission, along with a realistic understanding of what was happening on the ground. Now, these strategic errors were compounded by lack of planning for the war's aftermath, or more precisely, the wrong kind of planning, because there was some pretty good planning done. The assumption was, again, war of liberation. If there's going to be a problem, it's going to be a humanitarian problem. So let's plan for a humanitarian disaster. So what do you need for that? You need shelter, you need medical care, you need to stockpile food and water, and so forth. And ORHA, the Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Affairs under Lieutenant General retired Jay Garner, actually did a pretty good job in planning for that. And there was no humanitarian disaster in the wake of the invasion. But we know that he was planning just for the humanitarian aspect of this and not for an extended occupation, because there's, in fact, a great story. I think it's in Assassin's Gate. He's in Kuwait with his team, and the march up country is occurring. U.S. forces are approaching Baghdad, and he gets his team from Orha together in a restaurant in downtown Kuwait City for one final meal together, and they break bread, and then he says, gets them all together after dinner, and he says, okay, let's review the bidding. We get up to Baghdad, we make sure there's no humanitarian catastrophe, distribute food and water, make sure people are housed and cared for. We get the services running, turn it over to the Iraqis, and leave by September. And some wag, probably Megan O'Sullivan in the back of the room, goes, which September? Moreover, the U.S. military was intellectually unprepared for the type of conflict that soon emerged. The lack of counterinsurgency education was a deficiency in U.S. military professional education from the end of the Vietnam War to the Iraq War, and indeed a bit beyond. In the 1980s, and Con, I have to actually footnote him because he's the one that found this out or wrote this in a pamphlet on Forgetting Vietnam. In the 1980s, instructors from the Command and General Staff College trying to create a course on low-intensity conflict looked in vain for help from the Special Operations School at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, only to find that the staff there had been ordered to throw away their counterinsurgency files in the 1970s, presumably because we would not fight that kind of war again. But even if the military didn't study counterinsurgency, historical precedents, even in the immediate historical memory of those involved in decision-making, should have suggested the need for increased security in the wake of the collapse of Baathist authority. I'm going to name the various crises that had occurred, and these just in the previous 15 years before the Iraq invasion. Panama in 1989, the LA riots in 1992, Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, Kosovo. In all of these instances, there was widespread looting that destroyed infrastructure in the wake of the collapse of government authority. And yet we made no allowance, either in rules of engagement or in forces allocated, to prevent or stem the looting once it occurred. Instead, we get that wonderful phrase from Donald Rumsfeld, well, freedom's messy, stuff happens. The need for more troops was fairly clear. General Shinzeki, the Army Chief of Staff at the time, regrettably was right. He was in a meeting before the Senate Armed Services Committee, and he was asked by Senator Levin from that state up north of Ohio, which shall go nameless, what he thought was the number of troops needed to stabilize Iraq in a post-war scenario. And General Shinzeki replied honestly, having been the commander in Bosnia before this in the 90s. Well, Senator, you know, something on the order of what's been mobilized to this point, that is several 100,000. In fact, General Shinzeki was right on the mark. Instead, he was neutered by the Secretary of Defense, who immediately called General Shinzeki's estimate wildly off the mark, followed by the Deputy Secretary of Defense, who also called it wildly off the mark. And then Secretary Rumsfeld proceeded to name General Shinzeki's successor as Army Chief of Staff, this a full year before he was scheduled to leave his position. It was a not-so-subtle reminder to the other general officers and flag officers not to challenge the assumptions of a quick, high-tech war, and a cheap war at that. What happened in that summer of 2003, which is, I think, written down in Baghdad at Sunrise at some length, is the chaos that erupted in the wake of the U.S. invasion, which led to Iraqi disenchantment with the U.S. presence, despite widespread delight at Saddam Hussein's downfall. I ran into no one in Iraq who who was a champion of Saddam Hussein. Of course, they were all in hiding, but everyone I had talked to, Sunni, Shiite, Kurd, Christian, they all were happy that Saddam was gone. He was a brutal dictator to all elements of Iraqi society, to include his own family. But what they expected was that the United States could do something better. And when that failed to happen, and we couldn't make West Baghdad look like West Hollywood overnight, there was widespread disenchantment, and this was in part what fed the conditions that created an insurgency. But unfortunately, I've come to the conclusion that the beginning of the insurgency were errors of our own commission. Ambassador Jerry Bremer, L. Paul Bremer III, the head of the Coalition Provisional Authority, came to Baghdad in May of 2003, and his first two decrees as head of CPA, which of course in our vernacular stood for can't provide anything, was, number one, to de-Baathify Iraq, sort of as we denazified Germany after World War II. He decided he was going to de-Baathify Iraq, get rid of the influence of the Ba'ath Party on Iraqi politics. That's good to a point. Now, he missed the difference between Nazi Germany and World War II in 1945, which was totally prostate and completely devastated by military operations, and Iraq in 2003, where most of the country hadn't seen the American presence, and it was largely untouched. So the Iraqis psychologically didn't feel as defeated as the Germans did in 1945. But had Bremer limited the de-Baathification decree to the top several hundred Baathists, he probably would have been okay, and it was probably something that needed to occur. Instead, he listened to the very extreme views of his Shiite and Kurdish interlocutors, and he de-Baathified down to the fourth level, or the Furqa level. The Ba'ath Party being a paramilitary organization with Saddam Hussein and his family at the top, and then, his immediate advisors under that. And then you have the third level and the fourth level. Top three levels probably would have been okay. That's under 1,000 people. And we could have made exceptions on a case-by-case basis had we de-Baathified to that extent. But by going down to the fourth level, he put out of work and out of politics not just Saddam Hussein and his immediate band of thugs, but tens of thousands of ordinary Iraqi doctors, lawyers, engineers, civil servants, university professors, all the same people that our own war plans assumed would remain in place upon the collapse of the Baathist government. We expected that the civil servants would remain at their posts. It was part of the planning. And then by our own act, we removed them from their posts. And we left them without jobs, without pensions, without any means to provide for their families, and without a political future. And in one stroke of the pen, Bremer created the political basis for the insurgency. His second decree was to disband the Iraqi army. Now, it was quite clear that we had to get rid of the Republican Guard, the Special Republican Guard, the Saddam Fedayeen, all the instruments of regime control. But the regular Iraqi army was a widely respected institution in Iraq. It included both Sunnis and Shiites, mostly a Sunni officer corps and mostly Shiite rank and file, but not entirely. But it was seen a lot like Americans see the United States Army, part of the social infrastructure, part of what makes the United States great. And they believe the Iraqi army was part of their polity. Bremer instead, and again, our own war plans assumed that the army would remain intact. In fact, our own information operations encouraged Iraqi commanders, regular army commanders, to give up, surrender their units, and then they were told that they would be used to help stabilize and police Iraq in a post-war scenario. Our own war plans assumed that those several hundred thousand troops would be available. And in fact, I think they could have been. But instead, Ambassador Bremer, in his second decree, dissolved the Iraqi army. Now, in his memoirs, he says, well, I was just bowing to the obvious. They had taken off their uniforms and they had gone home. They had self-demobilized. And so this was, a fait accompli. And this is a really disingenuous statement on his part, because what he doesn't say is that they had taken their weapons home with them and that they could have been called back. We know that because several weeks later, we decided to pay them back pay to make sure they had a little bit of money in their pocket, because now you had several 100,000 armed young men on the streets with no way to take care of themselves, and they could easily turn to a life of crime, and many of them did. And we wanted to give them some back pay to make sure they had a little bit of money until they could find employment, which was hard to come by. And they all came back. So if we knew we could call them back, why didn't we call them back and reform the Army, put it under new leadership, maybe get rid of the top several hundred generals, and then use it, as our own war plans called for, to help stabilize post-war Iraq? We did not. And it was a huge mistake, because not only did he put on the streets several 100,000 armed young men, but he put on the streets tens of thousands of officers, mostly Sunni, who were without jobs, without their pensions, without a means to take care of their families, without a political future because the de-Baathification decree denied them that. And most importantly, in Iraqi culture, he had dishonored them. And in the second stroke of the pen, Bremer created the military basis for the insurgency, because many of these officers took into the insurgency with them their not inconsiderable military talents. The third main problem that Bremer created was his creation of the highly sectarian Iraqi Governing Council, which was staffed with political operatives, most of them who had spent the years of Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party outside of Iraq, who had come in with their very highly charged and sectarian political platforms. And they used the Iraqi Governing Council merely as a means to staff ministries with party hacks. And instead of getting the kind of technocratic government that might have been useful in the post-war scenario or in the stability scenario, we ended up with an Iraqi government with very little capacity and a very polarized political system at the top. Now, I think that there was an alternative to this, and that was to grow the new government from the ground up, to create stakeholders. If we were going to introduce democracy in Iraq, do it from the ground up. Create stakeholders at the local level first, and then build up and only create the national government a couple years into the occupation. But that was not done. He tried to, in his very centralized managerial style, tried to impose things from the top down, and I think we could see the results of that. There were not enough forces in 2003, 2004 to provide security, especially after Bremer disbanded the Iraqi army. Now, I use the Ready First Combat Team by way of example. We had 3,500 soldiers, and we were responsible for Rusafa and Adamiyah, that is central and northeast Baghdad, which had about 2.1 million residents. That is a security force to population ratio of about 1 to 600. New York City, by way of comparison, has 39,000 police for 8.1 million residents for a ratio of roughly 1 to 200. And in the counterinsurgency manual, it's written in there that the typical force ratio necessary to prevail in a virulent counterinsurgency operation is closer to 1 to 50. So we were only off by a magnitude of 12. The situation forced commanders and soldiers to improvise solutions on the ground. Organized crime and organized criminal gangs were initially the major problem. Saddam had let go tens of thousands of criminals out of Abu Ghraib the fall before the invasion, and these people had gone to ground within the neighborhoods of Baghdad and were preying on the citizens. The police that might have done some good were highly corrupt and inept, and there weren't enough of them at any rate. So we were it. The U.S. forces on the ground were the forces that were available to provide security. And again, you go back to General Shinseki comments that several 100,000 troops were needed. Had they been available in 2003, this would have been a much different war. Chaos on the ground led to widespread Iraqi disenchantment. Although a substantial majority of Iraqis were thankful for the elimination of the despised and brutal Baathist regime, they were reluctant to put their lives on the line for the sake of an uncertain future. The inexorable calculus of war soon turned the hoped-for campaign of liberation into an arduous occupation and a fight to defeat the growing insurgency, to stabilize Iraq, and to build legitimate governmental institutions where none now existed. Now, we missed a number of other major opportunities that first year. The first is in our use of money. Now, money is a weapon. General Petraeus said as much in an article in Military Review. He said money is a weapon that's every bit as important, maybe more important than bombs and bullets. And he's right. But it's only useful, I would claim, if it's used in a way that has immediate impact on the people, especially early in a war. Every army of liberation, General Petraeus wrote, has a half-life. Ours was pretty short. But we had to show the Iraqi people that things were going to get better, and the only way to do that was to make things better, both in terms of security and in quality of life and services. The people that could do that were the brigade commanders. We were on the ground. We had battalions and companies and platoons out there with the Iraqi people all the time. We understood what they needed. We were attending the meetings of the neighborhood and district advisory councils. We had a much better feel for what was going on than the folks in the green zone. Bremer did not like the Commander's Emergency Response Program. This is the program that provided, in my case, $6 million between July of 2003 and April of 2004 to do reconstruction activities in my zones in Baghdad. Not a lot of money by today's standards, but even the money I spent made a lot of difference to the Iraqi people. But there was $20 billion available that had been appropriated by Congress. But instead of siphoning off a portion of that money and giving it to the brigade commanders who understood what the needs of the people were, Bremer, again in his very top-down style, centralized reconstruction at the CPA level. And the only way he could do that, because CPA lacked the capacity to handle that kind of magnitude of money, is to basically contract it out to multinational corporations. Now, when we hired an Iraqi firm to do something like fix a sewer pipe or renovate a school, we were given the money right to Iraqi contractors who went right into the hands of Iraqi laborers. There was no security overhead because we didn't have to provide security for them. They lived in their own neighborhoods. But when you give money to a multinational corporation to do that, they siphon off about 40% for security. And then they, instead of hiring the local talent, they did some of that, but they brought in a lot of third country nationals from outside of Iraq. And so very little of this money went into the Iraqi economy. Most of it left the country. And so it was, you might have been fixing things, but it wasn't having the impact that money in a counterinsurgency operation is intended to create. The second thing that we missed was the opportunity to engage the Iraqi tribes. Now, I sort of fell into this by happenstance. I was inspecting a position at the Palestine Sheraton Hotel complex where much of the Western media had their base, and I had a platoon there because it was an important facility. I had a platoon there guarding it, and I was inspecting their positions, making sure the soldiers were cared for. This was about 2 weeks into my command tenure, maybe right after I wrote that email. And after talking to the soldiers in charge, the sergeants, they said, "Hey, sir, you need to go in and have lunch with the sheikhs." I'm like, lunch? Sheikhs? This is after several weeks of eating nothing but meals ready to eat and tea rations, so a nice lunch in the Sheraton Hotel sounded pretty good to me. But the sheikhs thing really intrigued me, so I said, "Go introduce me to these men." So we walk into the Sheraton Hotel, and I walk into a ballroom, which is about twice the size of this room. And there's about 250 sheikhs in their flowing robes sitting down in the audience, and there's about 5 or 6 of them on the dais facing the audience. And over their head is this banner that says Central Council of Baghdad Clans. And the proceeds are being filmed by Al Arabiya Television and several local stations. So, you know, I figure even if this is nothing more than the local version of the Rotary Club, it's probably a pretty good thing to get involved with. So I introduced myself to the head sheikhs. They realized who I was, that I was, you know, basically the man with the wasta, the influence in that area. And they invited me onto the dais with them. And every week thereafter, on Sunday, I would spend 2-3 hours with this group, talking to them, listening to their concerns, and then having lunch with them afterwards. It was enormously useful in terms of creating relationships. Good story, by the way. I get up there the very first time, get up to the dais, and I turn around, and they want me to say a few words of introduction, and I look out over the audience, and I'm half Arab, ana asli min Ramallah. My father's Palestinian, and I look out over this audience of 250 gentlemen, and they all look like my dad. And I like freeze. His nickname is Monty, and my wife after that christened the room of the 250 Monties. You know, for nearly a year I engaged these tribal sheikhs to bring them into support of the way forward in Baghdad and Iraq, but regrettably I did this alone. Lack of understanding of Iraqi culture led CPA to virtually ignore tribal engagement for a full year, and likewise led to significant misunderstanding of the ethnic, sectarian, and tribal dynamics in Iraqi politics. I actually sent up the chain of command what I was doing, that there were these groups, that the tribes were important. And the feeling at CPA was that basically we had won the war, we could remake Iraq in whatever way we wanted to, and the tribes were part of Iraq's past and did not have a role in Iraq's future, which is ironic considering that the tribal rebellion in Al-Anbar province in 2006 was one of the key turning points of the war. The lack of strategy, coupled with the absence of an operational concept and resources to achieve our goals in Iraq, led to a bit of evolution from below. But this varied unit by unit. And this is the problem with the conclusion in On Point 2, the Army's history of this time period. Yes, there was innovation taking place, and there were some units that got it right. But there was no overarching standard and operational concept that would make sure that all units were using an effective counterinsurgency doctrine. And this is what created a lot of problems for the U.S. Army in Iraq until the surge. Even then, we had our chances. I mentioned the defeat of the Baathist Ramadan offensive. It was in October and November of 2003 when the insurgents decided to launch a general offensive, which we beat back. The 1st Armored Division and other units in Iraq beat back pretty handily. We had killed, the 101st Airborne Division had killed Uday and Qusay Hussein the previous July. And in December, we captured 4th Infantry Division. My good friend Jim Hickey captured Saddam Hussein. And these events did have an impact on the insurgency. It took the wind out of the sails of what was Baathist-led resistance. If you look at the levels of violence in January, February, and March of 2004, they are the same levels as existed in the summer of 2008 after the surge. And after the surge, I'll remind you, people said, oh, we've now brought the level of violence down to a point at which Iraqi politics can once again move forward. And I would contend that the same opportunity existed in the first quarter of 2004. The problem is a new political overture was needed to bring the Sunnis back into the political process for the way ahead. And instead, Bremer triumphantly approaches the podium, says, we got him, and goes on with business as usual, relying on the weak and sectarian Iraqi Governing Council to write a transitional administrative law and to determine the way ahead. As a result, we lost the opportunity to re-engage the Sunnis, and the insurgency was radicalized as Islamic militants coming into Iraq from outside the country gained the upper hand. This period ended with uprisings in the spring of 2004, the April Uprisings. There were two of them. The first was in Fallujah, where a group of contractors took a wrong turn, drove into downtown Fallujah, were ambushed and killed, and two of their bodies were strung from a bridge in the center of the town. This led Bremer and the folks in Washington, Secretary of Defense and the President, to call for an immediate offensive into Fallujah to apprehend the perpetrators. This against the Council of the Marines on the ground, who felt that a more cadenced campaign could do the job in better fashion. But instead they were rushed into an offensive operation with insufficient forces, and then they got killed in terms of information operations. Because we weren't ready for the campaign. The Arabic media certainly was, and the insurgent media, the insurgent information operators were ready to broadcast to the world how we were destroying mosques and killing lots of civilians and doing those sorts of things that got the Arab street up in arms against us. And in fact, the Iraqi Governing Council threatened to resign if we didn't stop the offensive. I would say that Bremer probably should have accepted their resignation. We probably would have been better off. But instead, after having rushed the Marines into the operation right when it was on the verge of military success, they pulled the plug on it and told them to stop. And we got the worst of all worlds in that regard because not only did we get all the bad publicity of having gone in and done supposedly those egregious things that we didn't do, but then we didn't get the military victory on top of that. In south central Iraq and in Sadr City, the Jaish al-Mahdi rose up in response to the arrest of one of Muqtada al-Sadr's lieutenants, Mustafa Yaqubi. And these actions created a huge fight in Sadr City and led to Shiite militia taking charge in Karbala, Najaf, Kut, Diwaniyah, and Sadr City. And in fact, the main supply route from Kuwait to Baghdad, main supply route Tampa, was cut for a period of time, as 5 bridges along the road were destroyed. There were a lot of long faces in Baghdad, as I recall, as the supplies dwindled. The 1st Armored Division was turned around at the port of Kuwait and launched back into the fight. And for the second time, we faced a major insurgent uprising and beat it back pretty handily. My brigade fought a battle for Karbala, which is one of the chapters, I think Chapter 11 in Baghdad at sunrise, and destroyed the Jaish al-Mahdi there. And similarly, other units destroyed large portions of the Jaish al-Mahdi in Najaf, Kut, Diwaniyah, and Sadr City. We had Sadr on the ropes. And instead of completing the military victory and telling him that his presence was no longer wanted in Iraq, or arresting him for the murder of Ayatollah al-Khoi, which he was responsible for in the spring of 2003, we let him off the hook. And Bremer gave him a ceasefire in return for a promise not to use his militia and rearm it and to enter Iraqi politics. And instead, Sadr pocketed the compromise, rearmed his militia, had another uprising in August, which was beat back by the Marines in Najaf. Again, he was given a ceasefire with the stipulation that he enter Iraqi politics and not build up the Jaish al-Mahdi. Again, he pocketed the compromise. He did enter Iraqi politics. He also built back up his militia. And this led straight as an arrow to the civil war of 2006, when the Jaish al-Mahdi was unleashed to wreak sectarian havoc in Baghdad. With these 2 uprisings and our response to them, we had missed a major opportunity to end the insurgency by bringing the Sunnis back into the political process, and instead created the conditions for a division of Iraq along sectarian lines. Even then, the successes of the 1st Armored Division and other units in defeating the Shiite uprising across south-central Iraq in the spring of 2004, along with the Marine offensive in Fallujah, could have led to a resounding military success against the insurgency. Instead, These accomplishments were wiped out by weak political leadership that halted the offensive in Fallujah just when it showed promise, and likewise allowed Muqtada al-Sadr to escape the consequences of his reckless and irresponsible actions. The final mistake we made was our abandonment of our forward operating bases inside Baghdad in the spring of 2004.